reserving the right to object, the request that he's describing is not one that can pass this body. It certainly is not one that can pass this body unanimously. He's absolutely right. My friend and distinguished colleague from Illinois is correct in noting that I've had conversations and negotiations with Republicans, and I've also had conversations and negotiations with Democrats. I've been working on this for nearly 9 years, and at every moment we've made concessions to people on both sides of the aisle. I wish that the solution that he were offering today were something that could allow us to pass the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. Alas, it is not. And I would note that it's not as though this is something new or objectionable or even something, a passage of which would amount to a concession on his part. For one thing, the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act is a bill that he was an original co-sponsor of in a previous Congress. This is his bill. Now, you might ask what's different about the bill he championed a few years ago and the substitute amendment I put forward earlier today. The answer is that aside from a short subsection to temporarily alleviate nursing shortages in parts of this country, the only thing that we've changed is that we've added a variety of new provisions to combat some abuse in the H-1B program. And I've said, these provisions are drawn almost verbatim from the Durbin-Grassley H-1B reform bill, of which my colleague from Illinois has long been the lead Democratic co-sponsor. The only other thing that's changed from the time when the senator from Illinois would have stood by my side instead of in opposition and helped to pass this bill is the problem that he sought to solve when he supported this bill. That very same problem still exists and has gotten worse. As I indicated earlier, there are 40,000 people, 40,000 green card applicants in Illinois alone, plus their spouses and children, stuck in this awful backlog. These are individuals whose children are aging out of their temporary visas, and they're forced to return to a country they left behind long ago, a country that in many cases their children don't know and have never known. And so, to repeat, the amendment that I offered today and that has been the subject of some of my colleagues' remarks this afternoon in his unanimous consent request consists of nothing more than the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, of which my colleague from Illinois was once a leading sponsor, and a series of H-1B reforms that he himself has long sought to enact. If passed, it would provide relief to many hardworking families from both his state and from mine, and yet he objects. And as he objects, he offers up something else that he knows cannot possibly get close to passing this body by unanimous consent. And yet we could do that today. We could do that right now if he would lift his objection. He knows that I cannot and I will not, and on that basis I object.
The objection is heard. The senator for Illinois.
Mr. President, I'd like to make 2 points to my friend from Utah, and I know he has to leave for another appointment. The first point I want to make is what I support today is what I introduced and voted for when 68 senators, Democrats and Republicans, passed the comprehensive immigration reform bill, which you opposed. I hope that that shows my good faith intent when it comes to this issue. I'm not just thinking of something today that's never been considered on the Senate floor. It has passed on the Senate floor in a previous Senate. And I think it can pass again with your active support. The second point I want to make is this. For us to have dueling unanimous consent requests and both to object in this debate is really unfair to the people who have gathered in this gallery today, as well as those who are following this debate on television with literally the fate of their family and future in our hands. I would like to ask you a favor, to consider the following. When Senator Kennedy objected on your behalf yesterday or the day before in a similar manner, he suggested that we push this issue forward for a hearing in the Immigration Subcommittee of Senate Judiciary, where we both serve. That committee is not overworked. It considered one bill last year and no amendments. So let us try to prevail on the chairman of that subcommittee to have a hearing on this subject and to bring out all the facts before the subcommittee and the full committee in the hopes that we can find some sort of reasonable bipartisan compromise. If you will join me in that request, I hope that we can prevail on Senator Graham and Senator Cornyn.
Mr. President,
The senator for Utah.
I thank my colleague for his constructive observations there. With respect to the Gang of Eight legislation, yes, it passed in this body. And yes, I voted against that, as did a number of my colleagues. My view is that that was a piece of legislation that, while it entailed a lot of work by a lot of people who were trying to make things better, it was doomed at the outset for failure because the message of that bill and of those who were pushing it was essentially, you either pass all of this bill and all of its reforms, a large number of which, the majority of which I agreed with, or you pass nothing. We were literally told that. It's either this entire package or it's nothing. We spent weeks in the Judiciary Committee debating it and discussing it. I personally proposed dozens of amendments to that. What emerged at the end of that from the committee was this has been 6 years, so my colleague will forgive me if I don't remember the exact numbers. It was about a 700-page bill. When we got to the floor, what we debated and discussed was substituted out at the last minute. What we ended up getting was another bill that was, as I recall, 1,100 or 1,200 pages long. It was a different bill. But the message was the same with both of them. This is a package deal. You either reform all of what this bill reforms and do it at once, or you get none of it. And many of the sponsors of that legislation made clear that they would oppose any smaller effort. I believe this is exactly the opposite of the type of solution that will work. What's going to work here is if we start with incremental, step-by-step legislation. And if we start with something that the senator from Illinois has himself in the past sponsored, both as to the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act itself and as to the substance, the nuts and bolts of the Grassley Amendment. He's been on the cutting edge of supporting both of those things. If not here, where? If not us, who? If not now, when? This is what we need to do. I'm going to continue to come to the floor. I'm going to continue to seek unanimous consent and to pass this every way I can. As to my colleague's suggestion with regard to committee hearings, this has, of course, been the topic of committee hearings in the past, and it's been fully discussed. I would, of course, welcome any further committee action that the chairman might choose to hold, and I'd be happy to have any committee action. That, of course, isn't mine to offer or give, but I would always prefer more consideration of the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act than less. So if that's what we got to do, great. But I don't believe any further factual development is necessary here. Just for the record, I want to state this bill's ready to pass right now. This bill's got 365 votes on the House floor right now. This bill would become law right now, would pass out of the Senate, and would pass out of the Senate in a form that would be passed out of the House of Representatives ultimately, right now, but for this objection. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator for Illinois.
The senator from Utah is my friend, and we've worked very closely together on very important legislation. I trust him and respect him, though we disagree on the merits, some of the merits on this issue. What I think I heard was an offer, which I'm going to accept, of a good faith bipartisan request of the Judiciary Committee to have a hearing on this measure. It'll be the first hearing on it, and I think it's long overdue. In terms of the comprehensive immigration reform, I don't want to dwell on history, but we went through hundreds of amendments in Judiciary, scores of amendments on the floor. Everyone had their day in court, their opportunity to come up with a good idea, and yes, it did come down to one bill at the end, and you had to vote yes or no. I voted yes, and you voted the other way. This bill is not even close to it in terms of deliberation, in terms of amendments in that process. So let's start the right way. Let's have a hearing. You have a majority, your party does on the committee, so I'm not going to pull anything over on you, but let's do it. For the people who are following this and say, well, how did that end? Let us say to them, it ended by both of us agreeing to pursue a committee hearing on this important subject as soon as possible and appealing to the chair of the Judiciary Committee to ask for that hearing.
Mr. President.
Senator for Utah.
I thank my friend and distinguished colleague from Illinois, and I appreciate his dedication to detail and the hard work he's put into the area of immigration reform. Yeah, you're right. That was a difficult process that you went through 6 years ago, and I commend you, even though you and I reached different conclusions as to the ultimate outcome of that legislation. My point there is simply to say it is, and properly should be, always is going to be the case that it's going to be easier to get something done that's more narrowly focused. In this case, we've got a bill that the senator from Illinois has himself co-sponsored in the past. It's been modified by another provision that he has also sponsored in the past, and we should be able to do this one. It is not my place to commit on behalf of the Judiciary Committee or its chairman whether or not we're going to have hearings. I reiterate my view that no further factual development of this is necessary. I don't believe a hearing is necessary. I'm never going to object to someone holding more hearings on it, and if that's what the chairman of the Judiciary Committee is inclined to do, then I'm certainly not going to interfere with that. In the meantime, I'm going to continue to do everything I can to get this thing passed. It's ready to pass. It's ready to pass right now. And I'm going to continue to find every way possible to get this the consideration it deserves. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator for Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm coming to the floor to speak on a different subject, but I do want to acknowledge this is an issue that I've followed as well. I actually am a co-sponsor of Senator Lee's bill. I do hope that what my friend, the senator from Illinois, proposed in terms of a process, that process will take place and that we can get this legislation or a variation thereof passed through the Senate, that we can deal with this issue. It is something that I hear a lot from my constituents in Virginia, particularly in Northern Virginia. And again, while no piece of legislation is perfect, I think the direction that Senator Lee's put forward is one that I carefully considered before I co-sponsored the legislation. And again, the only way this is going to get resolved is if we go through this process. I think, again, there's nobody in the Senate that works harder on immigration issues and with more passion and willingness to get to yes on issue after issue than the senator from Illinois. So I thank him for his work as well. But Mr. President, I came down here today, and I'm going to still address the question that I came for, to actually continue the tradition of my friend, Senator Ted Kaufman, who had the distinction of serving here as a staff member for a long time and then filled in for a few years when Senator Biden became the Vice President of the United States. And what Senator Ted Kaufman did was he came during his tenure in the Senate on a regular basis and came to this floor and highlighted the contributions of exceptional federal employees, highlighted the work they do every day to make our nation and communities safer, healthier, and stronger. Now, I came to the floor earlier this year to congratulate 3 Virginians who were recognized by the Partnership for Public Service as finalists for the Service to America medals. Now, within the world of federal employees, this awards may not be as well known as the Oscars, but the awards, the Service to America medals, are known as the Sammys. During my time on the floor earlier when I spoke about the Virginians who were nominated, I spoke about Ambassador Michael Kozrak from Arlington, Cara de Castro from Haymarket, and John Wagner from Ashburn. Each of these public servants have made significant contributions to our national security, as well as to global peace and human rights. We are indebted to them for their contributions, and I congratulate them again for their much-deserved recognition as finalists. Unfortunately, none of this year's winners hail from Virginia. Still, I want to congratulate the 2019 Federal Employee of the Year, Victoria Braun of Wisconsin. Ms. Braun is a career public servant who has spent more than 37 years working in the VA system. Since 2015, she has served as the director of the Toma VA Medical Center, When she arrived, the center was struggling with unsafe medical practices, high staff turnover, and other issues impacting the quality of care that veterans were receiving. In the years since her arrival, there's been a rise in patient satisfaction and a dramatic drop in the use of opioids and other prescription pain relievers. Under Director Braun's leadership, preventable in-hospital complications have also dropped significantly, and the center has risen from one of the worst-ranked hospitals in the VA system to the top 10%. This remarkable turnaround that is making life better for our veterans is due in much ways to the work of Ms. Braun. So congratulations, Ms. Braun, and thank you for your service. Congratulations as well to all of this year's award winners who hail from around the country, not just Washington, D.C. And while the federal workers we recognize today are exceptional, the truth is they are not the exception. Federal employees across the country dedicate their lives to serving the country, to protecting its people, and to making sure our tax dollars are properly spent. Unfortunately, this commitment has not been honored by the Trump administration. In addition to the longest government shutdown in history, federal workers have endured pay freezes, hiring freezes, bad faith collective bargaining, and other efforts to dismantle our non-political civil service. This is wrong. It's also unsustainable. And ultimately, it will be everyday Americans who suffer the consequences of this administration's actions. If you drive out and drive down the morale of our workforce, the American people end up with a less good product. I commit that I will continue fighting here in the Senate to ensure this country is keeping its commitment to federal workers, because they deserve so much better than the treatment they've received recently. Mr. President, let me now, for a couple moments, turn to another important issue where I fear we're not keeping our commitments, and that is our commitment to our nation's historically black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs. I'd like to talk briefly in support of legislation introduced by my colleague from Alabama, Senator Jones, and my colleague from South Carolina, Senator Scott. The legislation they introduced is called the Future Act. The Future Act would provide a 2-year reauthorization of the mandatory funding for HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions that it's already expired on September 30th. This is a common-sense, bipartisan fix that is fully paid for. And it would allow us to keep our commitment to institutions across the country that are educating historically underrepresented and underserved students. Virginia is the home to 5 outstanding HBCUs whose funding would be preserved by this legislation: Virginia State University, Norfolk State University, Hampton University, Virginia Union University, which I was proud prior to my tenure in government to serve on the board of, and Virginia University of Lynchburg. All told, these institutions received nearly $4 million in funding last year that was now at risk unless we pass the Future Act. I have letters of support here from the presidents of Hampton, Norfolk State, and Virginia Union. These letters highlight the Future Act and the importance of this funding to the representative universities. I ask unanimous consent that these letters be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Recently, our colleagues in the House passed this important legislation on a bipartisan basis. Now it's time for the Senate to do the same. Let's pass the Future Act without further delay, and then work together on a comprehensive reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. As Dr. Harry Williams, president of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, said, America's HBCUs, quote, simply do not have the time for Congress to work out a deal. So let's put our broader policy differences aside for now and honor the commitments we've made to HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions before Congress's inaction harms students in Virginia and around the country. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator for Wyoming.
Mr. President, I rise to announce a new use of an old requirement. I rise to speak about the latest Senate scorekeeping report, which I filed this week in the Congressional Record, and the Congressional Record's available to anyone online. This report could show overspending by committees and a number of other things. This is the first such report since I filed a current law budget for the fiscal year 2020 as authorized by the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019. This week's filing tracks the Senate's adherence to that current law budget and provides up-to-date budgetary information about the federal government for Congress and for the public. For the first time, a copy of the scorekeeping report can be found on the Senate Budget Committee's website to allow the American people to better track Congress's fiscal decision-making. That's new. Let me repeat that. For the first time, a copy of the scorekeeping report can be found on the Senate Budget Committee's website to allow the American people to better track Congress's decision-making. Since this is the first time that the committee is posting the scorekeeping report on its website, I want to take this opportunity to explain the report for those taxpayers who are concerned, as I am, about our country's fiscal health and want to learn more. I hope that people will look at the future months at each monthly report. A current law budget allows the Senate to enforce the spending levels projected under current law. While it will not put us on a path to stabilizing our debt and deficits, like the levels approved by the Senate Budget Committee earlier this year would do, it tells Congress to stop making our fiscal situations worse, to stop making our debt and deficits worse. The scorekeeping report covers 6 primary areas. First, it shows whether authorizing committees are sticking to their allocation, which is just a fancy term for each committee's spending allowance. Now, we track that for the 1-year, 5-year, and 10-year periods in this report. For the October 2019 report, all committees are in compliance, and no breaches have been recorded since I filed the current law budget on September 9th. That's good news. Though with our debt approaching $23 trillion, going a month without violating the budget is not something to pat ourselves on the back over, but it's a good start. Second, the report tracks whether the Appropriations Committee is adhering to the discretionary spending limits imposed by the most recent Bipartisan Budget Act. For fiscal year 2020, the limit on regular discretionary spending for accounts in the defense category is $666.5 billion. And for the accounts in non-defense category, it's $621.5 billion. Since full-year appropriations measures for this fiscal year have not yet been enacted, the only budgetary effects recorded are for advanced or permanent appropriations made through our prior law. So third, the scorekeeping report tracks changes in mandatory programs. We call that CHIMPS, which is used by the Appropriations Committee. That's so that we aren't using this very important wording of changes in mandatory programs. Actually making changes in mandatory programs without people knowing. The Appropriations Committee uses those changes in mandatory programs to offset new discretionary spending each year. In recent years, the Budget Committee has ratcheted down the total amount of changes in mandatory programs that can be used in a given year in an effort to hold the line on spending. Pardon me. This year's total limit is $15 billion. That's extra spending. And the report tracks the Appropriations Committee's adherence to that limit thus far. Now, I know that many of my colleagues share my desire to finally end the practice of using changes in mandatory programs to inflate spending. So fourth, the report tracks the amount of emergency and overseas contingency operations spending in appropriations bill. Emergency spending is not constrained by discretionary spending limits that I talked about, but it has the potential to cost hundreds of billions of dollars each year. To date, for fiscal year 2020, there have been $8 million worth of emergency budget authority adjustments. That's with a B. These adjustments are the result of agriculture provisions in the additional supplemental appropriations for the Disaster Relief Act of 2019. Emergencies don't count against the budget, but they do go to increased debt. There's no requirement to adjust the budget to pay for emergencies. Fifth purpose of the report. Included in the report's information provided to me by the Congressional Budget Office. It compares top-line spending and revenue amounts known as aggregates to the current budget levels. The report shows there is currently enough room on spending aggregate to accommodate all outstanding regular appropriations and no additional room for revenue loss. And finally, sixth, the report includes the current balances of the Senate's PAYGO scorecard. PAYGO stands for Pay As You Go, a unique concept around here. In other words, was it paid for? If not, the report shows on the scorecard. The Senate's PAYGO scorecard, which is enforced with a 60-vote point of order, tracks the budgetary effects of legislation moving through Congress affecting mandatory spending and revenues. This report shows a zero balance on the Senate's PAYGO scorecard for the filing of new budgetary levels just last month. Now, as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, I try to come to the floor regularly to sound the alarm about our country's unsustainable fiscal course. We're on a perilous path, with Congressional Budget Office projecting our debt and deficits to skyrocket in the coming years. Debt is the cumulative amount, deficits are the annual amount. The deficit for the fiscal year that ended on September 30th reached $984 billion, while revenues were up $133 billion over the previous year, or 4% compared to that fiscal year 2018. Spending was up $338 billion, or 7% over the prior year. Let me say that again. We overspent $984 billion, but revenues were up $133 billion, but spending was up $338 billion. The Congressional Budget Office projects budget deficit for the current fiscal year to top $1 trillion. That's another $1 trillion added to our already high debt. That's overspending, in spite of increased revenues. We're long overdue for an honest